I remember my first time completely reading through the New Testament. The Gospels were great, Acts were good, most of the letters were insightful, but then I got to Revelation and I was just completely and utterly confused. I mean, what was this thing? It was so completely different than anything else that I'd read so far. Reading through the Old Testament, there's a few passages that are similar to Revelation in Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah, but for the most part, Revelation stands out as unique in the Bible. So what is it? Is it poetry? Is it prophecy, narrative, history? The writings are so strange, they're so different from what we are used to that we have a hard time agreeing on how to interpret it. That's one of the reasons why there's 1,000+ different interpretations of Revelation. Because some people are reading it as if it is poetry, and other people are reading it as if it is future history. Fortunately, while Revelation is nearly unique in the Bible, it is by no means unique in history. The book of Revelation gets its title from the first word in it, revelation, something which is revealed, or in Greek, apocalypse. Apocalyptic literature was a genre of writing in the ancient world, and we know what this genre looks like quite well, because while apocalyptic literature as a genre is pretty rare in the Bible, it was quite common in early Jewish and Christian writings. We have dozens of apocalyptic works, ranging from a few fragments of sentences to entire tomes that are just massive. And if we read these works, the book of Revelation and other revealed or apocalyptic writings in the Bible suddenly make so much more sense. Because like any genre, apocalyptic writing follows a formula to fulfill a purpose. Every genre has a purpose that it is designed to meet. Histories convey information. Legal documents specify a specific relationship between parties. Poetry conveys emotion, prophecies give warnings, and apocalypses are meant to convey hope. Now, some of you may be looking at me right now like I've lost my mind, but it's true. Apocalypses were meant to give hope. The reason we get terrified reading apocalyptic writings is because we're reading them from the wrong context. We're reading them from a place of security and safety. Apocalyptic literature really started when the people of God were exiles in Babylon. They had watched their cities be destroyed, their lands ransacked, their families murdered, and they had been carted off to serve their oppressors over 1,000 miles away from their home. The people had a problem. Where was God? Because it seemed like evil had won. So what was going on? And apocalypses were designed to answer that question. Because an apocalypse was designed to be a revelation, literally, to open people's eyes to what was going on around them. First, apocalypses start with a vision, where someone sees something that other people do not, usually being taken into heaven to receive this vision. The description found in the vision of Paul is fairly typical of this. While I was in the body in which I was snatched up to the third heaven, the word of the Lord came to me. Something is revealed to that person about an area of creation that we don't have experience, about heaven and angels and a spiritual war. The people apocalypses were written to were suffering in some way, often ignored by the culture at large. In an apocalypse, the people hear God's recognition of their pain and suffering, and the evil that they're facing, often systemic evil, is given names and shapes, and often fantastic shapes of monsters and dragons representing what they are facing. Often apocalypses contain a warning that the suffering that the people are experiencing is going to get even worse. Like in 2 Baruch, where the people are warned that their tribulation will come in 12 progressive phases of suffering. But God has not abandoned the devout, an apocalypse will remind people, because in the battle between good and evil, God has already won for the side of good, because an apocalypse reminds people God has far more powerful forces invisibly at work in the world than the forces of evil which oppress them. Descriptions of armies of angels are quite common in apocalyptic literature as a reminder to the people that God has armies fighting for them. It isn't just the armies that they see oppressing them every day. The war scroll is quite typical as it reassures people of the quality of armies that are fighting alongside God's people. The glory of God is with us, and the host of his spirits is in our step. Our horsemen are as the clouds and as the mist covering the earth, as a steady downpour shedding judgment on her offspring. As vast as the clouds, as numerous as drops of rain. You can't see them, but they're there. That's the reassurance that an apocalypse gives. Because what an apocalypse promises is justice in the end. The people who seem to be winning today will get their just desserts in the end. Don't worry. And the punishments for these people are often described in quite lurid detail. Like in Esdras, where fiery screws are shoved into people's ears who don't listen to God. Finally, most apocalypses describe heaven and the reward that God's people will receive if they persevere until the end. God is almost always figured very prominently in these descriptions, like in 1 Enoch, where God's throne is described in quite vivid detail. I saw an exalted throne, the appearance of which was like that of frost, while its circumference resembled the orb of the brilliant sun, and there was the voice of the cherubim. From underneath this mighty throne, rivers of flame issued. To look upon it was impossible. One great in glory sat upon it, whose robe was brighter than the sun and whiter than snow. All apocalypses were born out of suffering and despair and persecution. And in those circumstances, an apocalypse gives hope. Because an apocalypse recognizes the people suffering and says, this too will end. God has not forgotten you. God has not abandoned you. God is at work in ways that you cannot see. There is a mighty war at work beyond their mortal eyes, and they are significant to it. They matter. And their suffering matters in the big picture. It isn't in vain. And to people who are hurting, knowing that their suffering is not in vain, that they will be vindicated, makes all the difference in the world. These defeated people read the first apocalypses and they hear that suffering is not all that they will know, that pain will end, victory will come. And this is set in stone. A prophecy has conditions. God will judge the people because of their sins, but you can still repent. But not an apocalypse. An apocalypse is unchangeable. This will happen. Pain will end. You will have victory, and nothing can change that. But despite this, an apocalypse's focus is not on predicting the future. Instead, an apocalypse focuses on the current day, a little bit into the future, and then jumps straight to the end of time when this pain that they are experiencing will end for sure. Apocalypses are about taking people out of the hell that they are currently in and transporting them directly into heaven so they can get a picture of what eternity will be like using vivid imagery and powerful metaphor. Often this took the form of satirizing what was going on in the world, mocking or even gloating over the coming defeat of the people who are currently hurting God's people. Whatever it took to help them see beyond their current circumstances and put their situation in the perspective of God's eternal victory, so that they could trust that God was at work and this would end in paradise. Now, we don't have anything like that genre today. The closest that we'd have would be political satire, something like 1984 or The Crucible, where they skewer what was happening in that day and point toward where that will lead people. Not funny, but something that would show that day and their situation in a new light so that they understand it differently. Any similarities with today's politics that we find while reading 1984, for instance, are there not because 1984 is a prophecy, but because what it talks about is applicable today. Revelations or apocalypses are about revealing another reality at play, at work with our own. They aren't about keeping things hidden. They aren't about secrets and codes, and they aren't a roadmap for how everything is going to happen in the future. It's about giving hope to those who don't have any, and apocalypses are great at that. It's only terrifying to us today because we already have some hope, we have prosperity, we have peace, and reading it, we're afraid of losing what we have. Our context is wrong, and that has led to widespread misuse or even flat out abuse of this beautiful genre of literature. which is a shame because Revelation today is still helping people around the world who are being persecuted find hope. For more information on this subject, I highly recommend reading some of the original documents for yourself. Links can be found in the description below. As always, thank you for watching. Have a great day. See you next video.